Hello, everyone. Welcome to this conversation on affirmative action. In this conversation, we're going to introduce the concept of affirmative action by defining affirmative action, looking at the difference between trying to end discrimination and what affirmative action actually proposes. And then we're going to look at some categories of affirmative action initiatives. Then we're going to dive into kind of the history of affirmative action in employment and federally funded programs. And then we're going to look at a particular case involving a Christian university, Bob Jones University. So by way of introduction to affirmative action, we want to start with a definition. Affirmative action is a set of procedures designed to eliminate unlawful discrimination among applicants, remedy the results of such prior discrimination, and prevent such discrimination in the future. So I have these three words underlined. We want to eliminate unlawful discrimination, remedy the results of prior discrimination, and prevent discrimination in the future. And so this is a very proactive idea of dealing with discrimination currently, of remedying the results of past discrimination and preventing future discrimination. And so what we have to understand is that uh, after slavery for 100 years, we had a system that was racially uh, where racial discrimination was permitted. And as a result of that, we have a tremendous amount of inequality in society. And so, for example, you would have a college where all the employees or a vast majority of the professors are white men. And so, what do we do? If we just say, well, you can't discriminate in the future from hiring practices, that doesn't correct what already exists there in that particular institution. So what are we going to do about that? And this raises very, very difficult questions. And so affirmative action desires to eliminate discrimination now, remedy the results of prior discrimination, and prevent future discrimination. And so we want to see that in contrast to simply ending discrimination. We can see from this definition that affirmative action goes beyond simply saying we want to make sure we are not discriminating now and in the future. We are talking about also remedying situations. And also it just raises the question of how do you actually do this? How do you actually remedy the results of prior discrimination without discriminating against somebody else in the future? This is the central problem. And so we have to understand this complex dynamic between ending discrimination and taking some sort of affirmative action to correct the problems of discrimination. These are two related, but in a nuanced way, different things. So, what kind of affirmative action initiatives have occurred since the 1960s when the civil rights movement put in place the end of discrimination? What's occurred? There are there are several categories where affirmative action initiatives have taken place. We see them with regard to federal contractors. The government employees, or not just government employees, that's one area, but there's federal contractors, and these people employ people, and they are funded by the federal government to do work for the federal government. So there's going to be affirmative action initiatives with regard to the policies of federal contractors and their hiring practices. There's going to be affirmative action in the area of entities that receive federal funding from the government. So if you get federal funding from the government of the United States as an entity, then affirmative action is going to be an issue for you. And then lastly, if you get tax exempt status from the federal government, there's going to be affirmative action issues involved in that as well. So to kind of get our thinking going in this conversation today, we want to ask the question, why affirmative action? Why is it necessary to take affirmative action to deal with this problem? Why is corrective action necessary? Why can't we just move forward and say, everybody's equal now, everybody's on a fair playing field, and so we'll just allow the system to work itself out. We'll let the issue work its way out. Why do we need something different than that idea? Well, one of the reasons we can see in the words of Bob Jones III, president of Bob Jones University, who said in 1976, even if, in response to questions about their discriminatory practices, even if this were discrimination, which it is not, though the government disagrees, it is a sincere religious belief founded on what we think the Bible teaches, no matter what, whether anyone else believes it or not. So I use this quote to say that if the government, if the Christian community is resistant to ending segregation, ending discrimination, as you can see in this quote, he's saying that the discriminatory practices of Bob Jones University are what the Bible teaches, what we think the Bible teaches. It's a religious belief, and we should be allowed to do whatever we want. If Christians are saying this, then what would we expect from the larger society? Would we really expect anything different from the larger society if the Christian community, or if at least part of the Christian community, is taking this kind of position? Jonathan Pate, spokesperson for Bob Jones University in 1998, this is 20 years later, said, "God has made people different from one another and intends those differences to remain. Bob Jones University is opposed to intermarriage of the races because it breaks down the barriers God has established." And we're going to talk more about what their specific policy was. But for now, what we need to understand is as late as 1998, Bob Jones University was making a statement that said that their policies are not discriminatory, and they were relating them to the Bible. And they're saying this is what God has established. God made people different from one another, and it's okay to recognize those differences and treat people differently based on those differences. That's the position that Bob Jones took as late as 1998. And so why do we need affirmative action, or why does this become an issue? Whether you agree or disagree with it as a government policy, why is it an issue? It is an issue because of the depth of the racial issues in our country. If you think back to our original conversation of living in a racialized society, it's because we live in a racialized society that we have to ask this question, where we have to look at these issues of affirmative action. So affirmative action really is in two key areas, employment and in education. These are really the areas where we see the most tension and the most activity with regard to affirmative action. And the idea is, in employment, it's people ought to be able to get a job without regard to the color of their skin, without regard to their race. And with regard to education, it's you should be able to get into a school without regard to your race. You should be able to do that. And how do we change what exists, which is white domination in certain areas of employment and white domination in entrance to schools? How do we deal with that? So with regard to employment, here's what some of the history of affirmative action and employment. So this really begins in 1961 when President Kennedy issued Executive Order 10925, and that order said that federal contractors will take affirmative action to see that applicants are employed. And then it goes on to say indiscriminately with regard to race. And so basically the government of the United States takes the position in 1961 that federal contractors, people the government contracts with to do government work, because it's involving government money, these contractors must take affirmative action in their hiring practices. In 1964, obviously we have the massive Civil Rights Act of 1964. Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 specifically prohibits discrimination in all employment. Anybody that employs 15 people or more, you cannot discriminate in your hiring practices. And it established the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission to enforce these practices. So the Civil Rights Act of 64 broadens what Kennedy said to all employment, but it only denies, it only says you can't discriminate in employment anymore, but it does not create affirmative action program with regard to employment. So those are two different things. And as we said earlier, you have saying you can't discriminate anymore, and the government could come in and deal with case by case of discrimination. But that doesn't mean that we're going to come in and force you to take affirmative action so that if you don't have enough minority employees, you have to hire a certain number of minority employees. These are two different things. But the Civil Rights Act does lay the legal foundation of prohibiting discrimination in all employment. Johnson then, in 1965, issued Executive Order 11246, and that order requires the government contractors to document affirmative action programs through compliance reports. So this goes a little further than what Kennedy said. Now federal contractors have to document their initiatives and their programs to hire minorities and create these compliance reports. And then in 1969, the Nixon administration issued what was called the Revised Philadelphia Plan. And what that did was it required federal contractors in Philadelphia to hire minorities according to a federal timetable. In other words, this goes even further. It establishes a timetable in which you need to start to correct the discrimination of the past. And we need to see that you are moving forward and you are starting to develop a more diverse workforce. And then ultimately, this policy of the Nixon administration was extended to other cities. So here you see kind of the broader affirmative action employment initiative, but it is centered primarily in federal contractors. That ending discrimination and the government saying it's illegal to discriminate in individual hiring practices everywhere, that's one thing. But specifically, the government initiative was to demand that federal contractors, people that contract to do work for the federal government, take affirmative action in hiring their employees. And so we see a very broad base of that in three different administrations: Kennedy, Johnson, and Nixon, Democrats and Republicans pursuing this particular policy. Now that's going to continue in the 70s and 80s, but the Supreme Court in 1989 is going to strike down a city's minority contracting program. So you see the federal government's going to do this, but obviously then state governments are going to take initiative, local governments are going to take initiative, and this is going to start to spread out beyond the federal government into other entities. Well, in 1989, the Supreme Court struck down a city's minority contracting program and said essentially that state or local affirmative action programs must be supported by a compelling interest and be narrowly tailored to make sure the program furthers that interest. And it went on to say that strict scrutiny applies to state statutes which set standards for affirmative action. And so what the court's doing in 1989 is addressing the issue in employment of if you create a program where you say we are specifically going to hire minorities for this particular thing, then is that a violation of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 because it's now denying another race a job That's a good question, isn't it? I mean, that's an important question for us to come to terms with. And so the court is putting that question out there in Richmond versus Crossan, and saying we have to discuss discrimination against all races, not just one race of people. And so we have to deal with this particular issue as well. And so they struck down a city's contracting program, minority contracting program, that they saw as a violation of the rights of other races. So there's affirmative action in employment. Now we're going to look at affirmative action in education. It's broader than just education, but we're going to look specifically at education because it's definitely the area that is the focal point and develops around which the most controversy develops. Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 prohibited programs that receive federal financial assistance from excluding from participation or denying benefits to any person. And so basically, Title VI says that if you are a program that receives federal funding and you deny someone from participating or receiving the benefits of your program, we are going to withhold funds from you. You're going to lose your funding, essentially. And so any institution out there, and obviously many schools receive federal financial assistance. If you are you're denying people the opportunity to participate or denying them the benefits of your program, you're going to lose your funding. That's the basis of affirmative action in education. And so this particular this act caused a response within schools. Obviously, if you receive federal funding, you're going to be immediately concerned that someone's going to sue you and the government's going to come in and take away your funding because you don't have enough minority representation in your student body. So what are you going to do? The simplest way to deal with that problem was to establish quotas. And many schools established quotas, and they said a certain number of people that we admit every year must be minorities. And so in the University of California's case, they had a admissions to their medical school, and out of every like 100 applicants a year or admissions a year, a certain number were admitted were minorities. They admitted a certain number of minorities. They established a quota of how many minorities they would admit. And so a white applicant, a man named Backey, applied and he was denied and he sued and it went to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court said quotas are not constitutional. So this is interesting. So the government says that you can't discriminate and you'll lose funding, but then says you can't use quotas to not discriminate. And so quotas are not constitutional, but you can still use race as a factor in admissions. But quotas are not constitutional because they deny somebody else of their civil rights. And so you can use race as a factor, but you can't use quotas. That position by the Supreme Court in the Bakke case of 1978 really remains the position of the court throughout. So you see in Gratz versus Bollinger in 2003, the court said that adding points to applicant scores because of race is unconstitutional. This involved the University of Michigan. In Grutter versus Bollinger, a case involving the University of Michigan Law School, the court said using race as one of a number of factors is constitutional. So if you, these two cases are different because in Gratz, the University of Michigan was adding points to applicant scores based on their race. And the court said you can't do that. In Grutter, race was being used as one of a number of factors in the law school admissions, and they said that's okay. In Fisher versus Texas in 2016, the court said considering race as a special characteristic among other characteristics is constitutional. And so the University of Texas had this long list of characteristics that they would consider in a file review for an applicant's admission. And one of those special characteristics was the person's race. And the Supreme Court said again, that is okay. Quotas are not okay. but considering race as one of many factors is okay. So, with regard to education, then, this is going to play out very specifically uh, in uh, in the Christian world with regard to religious schools and with regard to one particular religious university, Bob Jones University. So I want to start with this question. Why does Bob Jones University, why does a Christian college get in the middle of this conversation? Why did that happen in the first place? Why this particular university? Well, Stephen Jones in 2005 issued an apology for the university, and it said this: for almost 2 centuries, American Christianity, including BJU in its early stages, was characterized by the segregationist ethos of American culture. We conform to the culture rather than providing a clear Christian counterpoint to it. So, what Stephen Jones, the head of the university in 2005, is saying is that we were wrong. And the date's important. That's a very short time ago that Bob Jones felt compelled to apologize for its past behavior. And so, why Bob Jones University? The answer to that question is because of the discriminatory practices of Bob Jones University and other schools. And again, I come back to the point that if we're trying to look at the problems in the larger society and we see the problems existing within the Christian culture, within the religious institutions, um, why would we expect one to not affect the other? Why would we expect? I mean, we would expect the Christian institutions to be different. We certainly can understand what Jones is saying is that the Christian institutions were infected by the larger segregationist ethos of American culture. So, Bob Jones University from 1927 to 1976 um, practiced, well, actually beyond that, um, made certain decisions that ended up putting itself in the middle of this conversation with regard to affirmative action. Uh, the university was founded in 1927 and it had a policy of white students only. Didn't originate in South Carolina, but it ended up in South Carolina as a very prominent institution in South Carolina. And they had a practice of white students only. Um, in 1971, in a court case, in the Green versus Connolly court case, the court decided that racially discriminatory private schools are not entitled to federal income tax exemption provided for charitable educational institutions. So this is the third prong of our conversation now on where the government is going to intervene. It's Green versus Connolly in 1971 that established the idea that private schools can have their federal income tax exemption removed because of discriminatory practices. And so in 1971, Bob Jones University responds to the Green ruling by admitting the first black students to their university, but requiring those students be married. So in 1971, I think this is very interesting. Uh, from 27 to 71, Bob Jones denied black Americans from admission to their university. In 1971, they responded to the Green Connolly decision because they were concerned about losing their federal tax exemption by admitting black students, but then created a policy that required that those students be married. So they admitted their first black students in 71, but said, we're only going to admit married black students. So that discriminates on a different level. Um, that creates an interesting question. Why would they only introduce black students who were married into their student body? Well, in 1975, when they started to admit single black students, we get the answer to that question because they then created a policy that prohibits interracial dating. And so this goes back to a previous conversation we've had about the sort of core issues involving segregation and why there was segregation in the first place. And we've said before that when you dig deep, it ultimately usually comes down to an issue of the mixing of the races. And here we see that um, rearing its ugly head in 1975 when this policy prohibiting interracial dating is established by Bob Jones University. And so in 1976, the Internal Revenue Service revoked Bob Jones University's tax exempt status because of this policy. Bob Jones sued the IRS. The Supreme Court upheld the IRS's decision. And then Bob Jones III responded to this whole controversy by saying what we quoted earlier, that this is a sincere religious belief founded on what we think the Bible teaches. And so Bob Jones takes a hard position in the mid 70s that the Bible says that interracial dating is wrong and that interracial marriage is wrong. So it's also in this period that Bob Jones University Press begins producing textbooks and curriculum materials for Christian schools and homeschoolers. It becomes one of the two largest producers of these materials in the country, Christian producers of these materials in the country. And as late as 1998, their spokesperson, Jonathan Pate, said, God has made people different. And they held on to this interracial dating, this prohibition on interracial dating, right through the end of the 20th century, and are still making the argument that people are different and that there are certain restrictions on how people, because of their differences, they have to be treated differently and they have to interact with each other differently. That's a really important thing to understand that this Christian university was arguing. Um, but in 2000, presidential candidate George W. Bush uh, visited Bob Jones University while he was campaigning in South Carolina as he was campaigning for the presidency, and he spoke there. And this caused a big controversy that he would speak at a university that prohibited interracial dating. And so, as a response to that controversy, Bob Jones did rescind their policy on interracial dating and started to permit it. And then years later, Stephen Jones, who was head of the college at that time, issued the formal apology that we have looked at. I think that's a really important series of events. I think it's really important to point out that two times Bob Jones moved forward in the conversation. The first was as a result of the threat of losing their tax exempt status. The second was around a political controversy involving a presidential candidate. I think that's very interesting to see what is actually moving the conversation forward. And certainly we should commend the university for making an apology in 2005 and moving forward. But we should also recognize the depth of the issues existent here for civil rights issues, how the post civil rights era, the complications of dealing with these issues in the post civil rights era, both in the larger community, but also within the Christian community as well. The third part of our conversation on affirmative action actually diverges a little bit, and we want to look at some of the economic and social realities as we address this question of what has happened, especially since the civil rights movement, with regard to these realities. Daniel Patrick Moynihan in 1965 issued a report from the Lyndon Johnson administration that was titled "The Negro Family: the Case for National Action." And in that very controversial report, Moynihan said that the problems of the Black family derive from previous patterns of inequality that originated in the slavery experience and have been maintained and reinforced by years of racial discrimination. Now, that particular conclusion was really questioned aggressively by a book that Herbert Gutman wrote in the 1970s, which is a very persuasive book, that this is actually not the case. But Moynihan suggested in 1965 that it was the case, and it was a very important conclusion that he drew from that. And in particular, Moynihan was arguing that social conditions determine economic conditions. For a long time, basically back since the 1930s, people have been arguing that it's economic conditions that determine social conditions, that determine the way people act and behave with each other. And Moynihan said, no, that's not true. That there are social situations that were created by slavery and Jim Crow that resulted in that have determined some economic conditions of Black Americans. And so this went against the conventional social science wisdom that economic conditions determine social condition. And so we, in this period, end up with this interesting conversation. We have liberals believing that to fix this problem, you need to remove the racial barriers and improve economic conditions. And the way you do that is through the civil rights legislation that was being passed in the 1960s and the war on poverty legislation that was being passed. So the liberal argument is going to be that if you remove the racial barriers that exist, that you will see and improve people's economic condition. You will be able to remedy the social problems that are existing within the Black community. And the problem with this argument is that those things were done in the 1960s, but in the 1970s, there was a steep increase rather than a decrease in the social problems. So all of these things were put in place by the liberal administration of Lyndon Johnson, but they didn't have the desired effect. So James Julius Wilson has looked at this and in 1987 wrote a really compelling book in which he said that, quote, despite a high rate of poverty in inner city areas during the first half of the century, rates of joblessness, out of wedlock births, single families, welfare dependency, and serious crime were significantly lower than they are today, 1987, and did not begin to rise rapidly until after the mid-60s, with extraordinary increase during the 1970s. And so Wilson is arguing something that is just a historical fact and an economic fact, and a social fact, and that is that you get these programs in the 60s to deal with these problems, but you also get a really significant increase in all of these social problems. And why is that the case? That is a really important question to address. Wilson said, well, conservatives said that the cause of the social problems is welfare dependency. And that essentially it's the welfare programs of the 60s that caused the social problems. And that the solution is to end welfare, is to go back to a pre-welfare state America. Stress rugged individualism, all those things we've talked about in this course. Liberals argued, on the other hand, that the cause is contemporary racism. And the solution is more government programs, more attempts to remove these barriers that they attempted to remove in the 1960s, and that would solve the problem. But Wilson argues that there is some truth to both the conservative and liberal argument, that certainly there are problems with the welfare state, but there are also problems that have to do with contemporary racism, as the liberals argue. But he argues that neither of them really have their have an understanding of the actual problem, that there is some truth in both, but that the real problem is Black male joblessness, and that the solution is a comprehensive national jobs strategy, that none of the problems of the Black community will be fixed until you deal with the issue of joblessness, and that essentially the problems themselves have emerged from the joblessness condition. So he goes back to the previous argument before Moynihan, that it is economic conditions that cause social conditions. What exactly did Wilson argue? Well, Wilson argued, and is again very compelling, that there are 5 core factors that create these economic and social realities of the problems that exist within the Black community post-civil rights era. He said, number one, historic discrimination, you can't ignore that, helped to create an impoverished urban Black community because Black newcomers faced far more discrimination in labor markets than other migrants. And he doesn't deal so much with housing discrimination, but we've seen that as well. And so we can't deny the fact of historic discrimination. But he argues that's far more important than contemporary discrimination. That it's historic discrimination that's critical. But then he goes beyond that and he says that's not the only factor. He says, number two, Blacks migrated into inner cities in very, very large numbers, especially after World War II, from 1945 through the 1970s, which made finding economic niches, as other smaller migrant groups did, almost impossible. To find that niche within the economy of what Black migrants could do was extremely difficult. In part because of historic discrimination and contemporary discrimination, but also because there are just too many. There's just too many people flooding into cities over a long period of time for them to find employment. He says, thirdly, that this continued influx of young migrants skewed the age profile of inner city Blacks. The median age of inner city Blacks was 23.9 years compared to 30 years for whites, which led to increased economic and social problems that correlate with age. We just know this to be true, that there's certain problems that correlate with age, such as having a lower income, a higher unemployment rate, more crime, more out of wedlock births, and greater dependency on welfare programs. That this skew in the age profile had an effect on all of these other things. That thirdly, that the change in economic structure, important changes that occurred in the 60s and 70s, such as the shift from goods producing to service producing industries, the polarization of the labor market into low wage and high wage sectors, changes in technology. For example, in agriculture, technology forced a lot of people off of farms because machines started to do work that people used to do, and a lot of unskilled labor became obsolete. The movement of manufacturing jobs out of inner cities, either to the suburbs, where it was very difficult to move as a poor Black person, or to other countries. The decline in low education, unskilled jobs, economic stagnation of the 70s and wage stagnation of the 70s, and an increase in the labor force due to the entrance of women that occurred from the 1960s forward, when married women started to pursue careers and take more and more jobs in the labor market. So important changes in the economic structure had to do with all of the rise in these social problems. And then lastly, the social transformation of the inner city brought about by the movement of a stable working class Black family or Black families who benefited most from affirmative action programs and were able to move out of the inner cities as a result into higher income neighborhoods and suburbs, which poor Blacks couldn't get into, which created highly concentrated areas of extreme poverty back in the inner cities with limited access to steady jobs and job networks, with a shrinking pool of marriageable, economically stable partners. and a lack of exposure to conventional role models. Again, it's a very, very compelling argument, worth our consideration in trying to understand the economic and social realities of urban Black communities in the post-civil rights era. So in this conversation on affirmative action, we've looked at the definition of affirmative action, the difference between ending discrimination and affirmative action programs, and some categories of affirmative action initiative. We've looked at the history of affirmative action, we've looked at what happened at Bob Jones University, and we've looked at some economic and social realities. So some questions to consider from our conversation today. Should Christians support affirmative action programs? Why or why not? What are the moral implications of the actions of Bob Jones University? And then thirdly, was the Bob Jones University apology sufficient? Why or why not? Thanks for joining this conversation today. God bless you and have a great day.